Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kerouac Almasian. Yesterday, when I posted the video with Professor Marandi, I was a little bit ill. Today, I'm a little bit doing better. But apparently, I have a COVID. I didn't test myself, but I have the similar symptoms that I had the last time, but I'm doing fine. So today, I'm coming to you with another video. And this is about Austin Tice, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Austin Tice was a former U.S. Marine Corps veteran, and he came to Syria in 2012 illegally. And he was a freelance journalist covering the wars between the so-called Free Syrian Army and the Syrian army. Apparently, he was in southwest of Damascus in a place called Jdedet Artuz. So how I found about this, and why I'm telling you about this, because there is now a new report by the CNN that says the Biden administration is contacting the Assad government in order to release him, because they say he has been kidnapped or detained by the Assad government 10 years ago. So I went to his Twitter account. First of all, I just want to mention a few things before we go into this in details. This is his personal Twitter account, Austin Tice. He says he's a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. In the past, he was a law student at Georgetown University and freelance journalist. His last tweet was on the 11th of August, 2012. And he says, spent the day at a Free Syrian Army pool party with music by Taylor Swift. They even brought me whiskey, hands down, best birthday ever. I mean, to be honest with you, if you bring any whiskey to anywhere that belongs to the Free Syrian Army, you would be decapitated. But anyways, so Austin was, yes, he's a journalist. But however, in Syria illegally. He didn't get any sort of a visa. He arrived in Syria illegally, and he was covering the military operation of the so-called Free Syrian Army against the Syrian army. And here he says, aside from Rastan, where there was a state of open war, I think Jdedet Artuz was the most dangerous place I have ever been here. Glad to be out. So this was on the August 10, 2022. This was one of his last tweets that he located himself, actually, where he is. And if you want to know where Jdedet Artuz is, so this is on the Google Maps. This is Damascus, the capital city, and this is Jdedet Artuz here. And we have to know that in Jdedet Artuz, Dareya, Sahnaya, Ma'adamiye, Ashrafiyat, Sahnaya, all these areas, Qatana, were all war zones here during 2012. And there was a huge military offensive by the so-called Free Syrian Army against Al-Mazza airport and from Dareya as well, Ma'adamiye. So they were trying to conquer the city of Damascus, or the capital city, from the southern side, and all this support was coming. If you check already the highways, some of them goes to the Golan Heights and others are going to Jordan, right? So from Daraa and all this highway, all this support used to come to these militants in these areas in order for them to continue the fight against the Syrian army. So before we continue this, I want to make a few things very clear. I'm myself a journalist, and I've been targeted to persecution and prosecution. And I'm going to go public about this very soon. But I have to solve a few things first. But up until then, I want to tell you that I know what it means to be a journalist, and especially when you are, I would say, illegally detained or inhumanely treated, etc., etc. I don't know what's the situation of Austin Tice and whether or not he was a journalist or he was a spy. He was a former U.S., as I mentioned, Marine Corps veteran, right? But anyways, he was a journalist in Syria, but he was illegal in Syria. This is the case. And in any ways, I am 100% for his release. I hope that he was treated well and humanly. I hope that no one tortured him and no one mishandled his situation when he was in Syria, if he is in the hands of the Syrian government. I really hope that his parents would finally find some peace and relief. 10 years is too much, in my opinion. But the American administration as well didn't really try to release him during these years. The only time that they tried to release him was in, I believe, under the not believe it's the accurate information. It was by Trump and Pompeo. So Trump and Pompeo in 2020, Pompeo actually, he called Syria, and I think he called the chief of the Syrian national security apparatus, and he spoke personally, but he didn't present any concessions. He didn't want to give any concessions. He was very arrogant. He refused to give any concessions or any positive initiative to the Syrian side. So this was mediated by Abbas Ibrahim. Abbas Ibrahim was the head of the Lebanese general security apparatus, or the head of the spying office in Lebanon. And these talks have failed. Now we have another initiative. It seems this time the negotiations are happening in Jordan. And this is the article by CNN. It's published on Wednesday, May 3rd. Blinken says U.S. is engaged with Syria in efforts to free missing journalist Austin Tice. The United States is engaged with Syria, engaged with third countries to try to bring detained journalist Austin Tice home, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Wednesday. We're extensively engaged with regard to Austin, engaged with Syria, engaged with third countries, seeking to find a way to get him home. And we're not going to relent until we do, Blinken said in remarks at a Washington Post event on World Press Freedom Day. You remember this event because we're going to come back to it later. Tice was taken hostage in Syria in 2012. President Joe Biden declared last year that the U.S. government knows with certainty that he has been held by the Syrian regime and called on Damascus to cooperate on efforts to release him. The government of Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad has not publicly acknowledged they are detaining Tice. The U.S. doesn't have diplomatic relations with the Syrian regime and has voiced opposition to rapprochement with Assad. Excuse me, as I mentioned, I'm still ill a little bit. Anyways, Blinken didn't provide details about the engagements to bring Tice home. White House and State Department officials would not confirm a report from the Wall Street Journal that U.S. officials had held talks with Syrian officials in Oman. We cannot confirm any specific meetings, past or present. As you know, in general meetings and negotiations to secure the release of wrongfully detained Americans, that is incredibly sensitive, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said at the White House briefing. We want to be really, really careful and mindful and don't want to confirm any specific conversation from the past or in the present. I think she's confirming without confirming that there is talks between the Syrian side and the American side. And I'm sorry that I said in Amman, in Jordan. It's in Oman, in the Gulf country of Oman. That was my bad, my misspelling. But even though she doesn't acknowledge that there was or there is negotiations happening between Damascus and Washington, I can confirm on Syriana analysis that there are talks between the Syrian and the American side, direct talks in Oman and with mediation of the Omani leadership. And I think this is a good news. And I hope that the American side would present some concessions, and these concessions would be in the form of turning a blind eye to the Arabic rapprochement with Syria and the return of Syria to the Arab League. And today we know that the Secretary General of the Arab League said that Syria's return to the Arab League is very likely before this scheduled Arab League meeting in Riyadh in the coming weeks. So that would be a good concession, in my opinion, if both sides proceed in their advanced talks. And I know this is unrealistic at all, but it would have been, Syria would have gained so much popularity and so much support from all around the world if they said in one way or another, publicly or through their media outlets or through their, every government has its own speakers in the media, in the press, etc. If they would link the issue of Tice with Julian Assange. What if Syria told the United States that the US must drop all the charges against Julian Assange in exchange for releasing Tice? That would have been really, really amazing. I know it's unrealistic, and Syria, I don't think they will do this. But if they have done this, it would have been a big, big, big thing. And Syria would have gained so much popularity all around the world. But speaking of Julian Assange, and you remember, as I mentioned, there was this event, New York Times or Washington Post event about free press, and the event was interrupted, and there were some ladies asking for the freedom and release of Julian Assange. Take a look.
In particular, I'm curious whether you've been able to talk.
Excuse us, we can't use this day without calling for the freedom of Julian Assange. The Biden...
They cut the voice.
The extradition request for Julian Assange.
2 hours and not one word.
Take it easy, take it easy, take it easy, guys.
Not one word about journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was murdered by the Israeli
we're here to celebrate freedom of expression, and we just experienced it. Let me continue, Mr. Secretary, to ask you about Evan Gershkovich and your efforts to get him free.
I mean, the thing is that when we are, you do an event about free press and freedom of expression, it would be essential to speak about also the issue of Julian Assange. But because the United States doesn't consider Julian Assange a journalist, that's the case. And they use the Espionage Act against him. So it's ridiculous. In the United States, they say freedom of press and freedom of expression are pillars of our democracy, etc., etc. But at the same time, they use their powerful laws against a journalist. He's a publisher. He didn't hack into these documents. He published these documents. Similarly, other journalists and other outlets published these documents, but he dumped the most amount, I would say, of these documents, and he harmed the reputation of the United States, and he exposed the crimes of the United States. Yes, I understand. So powerful people want to come after him. But this issue will stay forever. Like every time they speak about freedom of press or freedom of expression, etc., etc., somebody will come and ask him about Julian Assange. So they cannot really buy a reputation and claim that they champion this freedom of expression, etc., etc., unless they really free Julian Assange and let him go from the Belmarsh prison. And look, the same question was asked. So the White House press secretary refuses to answer a question about Julian Assange when asked about criticism of double standards in calling for the release of Evan Gershkovich while pursuing prosecution of Assange.
Freedom question. Advocates on Twitter today have been talking a great deal about how the United States is engaged in hypocrisy by talking about how Evan Gershkovich is held in Russia on espionage charges, but the United States has Espionage Act charges pending against Julian Assange. Can you respond to that criticism?
So, what is the criticism?
Well, the criticism is that the argument is that Julian Assange is a journalist who engaged in the publication of government documents. The United States is accusing him of crime under the Espionage Act, and that therefore the United States is losing the moral high ground when it comes to the question of whether a reporter engages in espionage as a function of his work. So can you respond to that?
Look, I'm not going to speak to Julian Assange in that case from here. What I will say is, and you heard directly from the president when today in his statement on this anniversary, but also during the dinner where he talked about the freedom of the press and how important it is to protect journalists, because it is part of our democracy, right? It is important to have that if we want to have a democracy, right? It is part of how we move forward, telling the facts, being able to tell the truth, and be able to reporters to do that freely. And so the president's going to continue to speak to that. The president's going to continue to work to make sure that these Americans who are, again, held hostage, who are wrongfully detained, come home. And that is something that we have seen under this administration. He's been able to do more than a dozen times. And so you see this president's commitment in just this last 2 years. We put forward additional tools to do that, to deal with this matter. And so that's what I can speak to. That's what I can speak to the president's commitment on this. I'm not going to weigh in on comments about Julian Assange.
She completely ignored the case of Julian Assange. She completely spoke about a different case. And she was asked about Julian Assange, and she spoke about a completely different case. But she condemned herself and her administration by saying that this administration is committed to freedom of press and freedom of expression, and that these freedoms are pillars for the represent pillars for the American democracy. So what happened to these pillars when it comes to Julian Assange? So there is clearly double standards in dealing with different type of journalists. If you're a journalist that is friendly to the American administration or the U.S. empire in general, then yeah, the U.S. will try to save you and will come to practice pressure, whether it's Tice or whether it's the American journalist detained now in Russia, etc. But when it comes to Julian Assange, even though Julian Assange is not even American, but he's been threatened to be extradited to the United States, right? It's completely big double standards, in my opinion, that the US doesn't have the upper moral higher ground to speak about these freedoms, unfortunately. So what do you think about this case, guys, the Austin Tice? Do you think that Syria should release him? I do believe 100% that Syria should release him, and in exchange for compromises from the American side. And I do believe that it would be a really great step by Syria to ask for the release of Julian Assange and link this case with the case of Austin Tice. That would be a big boost for the image and the reputation of Syria all around the world. This is just my opinion. But what is your opinion? Let me know in the comments below. I've been your host, Georg Almasian of Syriana Analysis. If you're new, please subscribe, hit the like button, share these videos with your friends. My channel deserves so much, in my opinion, bigger audience. And if you want to support my independent work, please become a patron. Link in the description below, and see you next time.